Hey everybody, welcome back to Jägerhorn. The topic of today's video is the two lift hills of the coaster, as well as the two first drops following these, which might seem like a little bit of a trivial thing perhaps to dedicate hours of work to, but in hindsight I have to say this is one of my favorite parts of Jägerhorn by far, and honestly one of my favorite things I've ever done in Planet Coaster. And that is not to pat myself on the back too much, it's honestly something which kind of happened throughout the project. I never really intentionally at one point thought of doing things this way, but it sort of happened as I worked on this ride and sort of came together in this way eventually. So what I'm talking about is we've got the two lift hills over here, which are set up as one of the most important parts of the ride, but honestly I haven't really talked about it that much so far. So what I was going for here is having two lift hills that kind of go up a mountain in a sense that's kind of similar to a funicular railway, which is an element which will come back into the theming of these. And I wanted to make them interact as much as possible. So the first drop is the one that curves around the other one and makes that sweeping curve first underneath the lift hill of the other one, and then going over a little tunnel which the other one dives under. And the second drop is then the big one, which is the largest and most thrilling drop of the ride probably, and kind of almost the climax near the end of the ride really. So what I like most about these things is that during building the layout it sort of came together that these would interact and be the sort of crossing point, because you also kind of notice that the first part of the ride really plays around the church area and is kind of at the front of the whole path boulevard area. And then the second lift hill is at the same place, but it goes into completely the different direction. And after the second lift hill you go into a whole different part of the park, into a part which is less of a mountain and more of just a slightly hilly section with interaction with a queue and a lot of trees. So the two halves of the ride are pretty split, and they're kind of different as well in terms of speed and elements, where the first part is really having a lot of curves and going at a pretty moderate speed alongside the hillside. The second part of the ride really starts off with this crazy dive into a tunnel, and after that a bunch of really high speed airtime hills and curves. So they're kind of different all around, and this part here is where they meet, and the one part where they have interaction as well. And this is something which you can see already in the video. It doesn't happen every time. I might need to adjust the block break still a little bit, but if all goes well and if the dispatch time matches up to what it should be, then both cars should arrive at the top of the lift hill at exactly the same time, and then one car, or train I should say, will spiral around the other ones. And I just really like the interaction of the two trains, because it means that whatever train you're in, you can always see the other train arriving at the top of the lift hill at the same height, at the same speed, right in front of you but in the other direction. And then after that, going down the first drop, you can either see the other train spiraling around you, or you can spiral around a train, and if you look to the center of that curve you can see the other train go down. So I thought that was some really cool interaction, and really one of my favorite parts of this ride, if not my very favorite part, at least when it comes to the coaster experience itself. And beside from that interaction, I wanted to make sure that you can actually see this whole thing happening from the path as well. So there's quite a bit of open path right next to this and underneath the first lift hill. And I'm trying to also theme this in such a way that there is a little bit of theming very similar to the rest of the ride, but most of the foliage is kept quite low, and I don't want to add any obstacles from the viewpoints, just to make sure that you have the view as much as possible of the two trains going down their drops at the same time. So yeah, that's the sort of technical explanation behind it. And then when it comes to the theming, like I said, I wanted to keep this as low as possible, just go with some very close to the ground shrubbery, which also kind of is reminiscent of having the shrubbery or the trees at a very high altitude, because you typically get these very low pine trees at a high altitude, whereas pine trees are much taller at a lower altitude. So that actually kind of adds to the theming as well, if not the forced perspective. And what I also wanted to do is kind of dress up the lift hills as well as the first drops in a sense that is kind of similar to a funicular railway as well. So the first lift hill will get this huge girder iron structure with lattices and everything to try and make this look as much as possible to one of these old funicular railways that go up mountain cliffs and stuff like that. And the second lift hill will be a little bit more simple since it's mostly supported by the terrain, but also just get a similar overhaul to the catwalks. And if I remember correctly, I'm starting off here with the bridge. Just wanted to build these 2 stone pillars to make sure that there's something of a foundation to connect the steel of the bridge to, and then shaping out the curve of the bridge, and then basically filling in everything in between, which is not as hard as I expected it beforehand. It is actually pretty easy to try and make these look as symmetrical as possible. You might be able to see some similarities to regular bridges, which are just horizontal. It's basically the very same concept and a very similar look to many regular bridges, just placed at an angle. And honestly, for inspiration, I just turned to Google Images and looked up images of funicular railways. Most of them aren't quite as fancy as this is, because of course they are usually just a form of transport or some kind of industrial thing, or maybe they're used for a ski resort. So usually they're a lot more minimalistic and less fancy than this one. But you know, because it's a theme park ride anyway, I wanted to try and dress this up as much as possible and kind of make it look more like a Victorian bridge or something like that. The only difficulty with all of these things is that there's no very small steel beams, so I do have to use these very small wooden beams in the middle here. But I hope that, given the context of everything around it being steel and overall having the design of a steel bridge, I hope that it ends up looking like a believable steel look anyway. Now the rest of this detailing is honestly just kind of guessing whatever things should be like. I'm honestly not a structural engineer, so I have no idea what a bridge would actually have to be like to be structurally sound, so this is just based on what bridges look like. But I think it's pretty much on point. I think it shouldn't collapse onto itself. I just love it when roller coasters go for unique support structures. If I can go on a bit of a tangent, because after this I'm getting into the catwalk, and God knows that was a bit of a annoying thing to do and pretty time consuming. So what you don't very often see is roller coasters that theme their support structures. Obviously it's something that is quite difficult to do, and it really requires a kind of cooperation between the coaster manufacturer and the park and designers, and really a lot of people from different disciplines, I suppose, to get a themed support structure. But when they're used, they're one of my favorite elements on roller coasters. I think Baron 1898 is a very obvious example that is definitely, at least I think, one of the best looking lift hills in the world. It has a lift hill which doesn't use the standard B&M supports, but uses a mine shaft like structure to emulate the mine theme of the entire ride, which is really cool. I know Alpengeist in Busch Gardens, Williamsburg, has ski lift like supports. I'm not entirely sure how much they look like an actual ski lift, but it's still a really fun touch to the coaster. And there are many very similar cases of roller coasters having unique support structures. I think the roller coaster that is most comparable to this one is probably Expedition Everest in Disney, which has a very similar catwalk running up a mountain as the coaster goes up the mountain. A difference is that over there the coaster actually goes into a tunnel at the end of the bridge, but it's still very similar, and it also looks very much like a funicular railway, I think. So yeah, I love those support structures. Definitely one of my favorite touches on roller coasters whenever they're possible, but obviously they're quite limited when it comes to the theme, because you have to incorporate it into the theme in some way. And Alpengeist having an alpine theme, and Baron 1898 having a mine theme. Stuff like that definitely works out, but it only works out in very, very specific cases like that. But I thought in Jägerhorn it was a very good opportunity to do it as well. So yeah, there goes. Now for the rest of these catwalks, I wanted to slightly change them a little bit, because this is just a little bit of a pet peeve of mine, but I wanted to do something about it anyway. One thing which I kind of dislike about catwalks or supports or anything that you're given from a game itself that you don't have to build yourself is that even though they might look good, like the catwalks and supports in Planet Coaster look great, they are always the same. So whoever builds a coaster always get the same looking catwalks and the same looking supports, and that is something that just irks me slightly, because after years of playing this game and after having seen so many different creations from different people, you know, no matter how creative certain things are, you always notice the same catwalks. You always notice that they have the same texture, the same look and everything. So in this case, I wanted to just use that catwalk as a bit of a skin to put my own theme on and put a bit of a thematic spin on it as well. So I'm trying to make this metallic standard default catwalk look like a wooden catwalk, which would be more in place on a mine train coaster. But the disadvantage of doing that, I suppose, is that you have to replace every single step on the thing with a small wooden step, and you have to replace all the railings on the exact angles, etc. with the wooden ones. But I think in the end it's kind of worth it. I like the slightly changed look, even if from the coaster itself you don't notice it that much. These are just the details that, you know, if I didn't change them, they would kind of stick out to me at the end. And because of that, I just wanted to add this to it. Doesn't mean that I would do this on every single one of my coasters, and it definitely doesn't mean that it's something I dislike about a coaster if it doesn't have a unique catwalk. But I think in case of a mine train like this, where every structural element of the coaster kind of becomes part of the theming, it's something that I definitely wanted to change. In hindsight though, when I did this first stair, I quickly realized that I could have just built a few steps and then just copy-pasted those all over the place. So I'll definitely keep in mind to do that with the second staircase, as you'll see. And the rest of this is really just trying to support this thing in a way that would visually make sense. Although I do have to say, there will definitely have to be some steel beams hidden underneath this structure, because I don't think a coaster would be approved by safety, whatever kind of institution goes on safety roller coasters. I don't think that institution would be okay with a coaster being supported by a few wooden beams, so there is probably some kind of hidden actual structure underneath all of that. And for the second catwalk, I wanted to try a very similar design, but just with a few small differences, using different wooden posts and stuff like that. I do want to apologize for moving the camera so much during these time lapses. Honestly, what I always try to do is minimize the amount that I move the camera around in these, because as much as it helps in gameplay to move your camera around and see everything from different angles, when you speed up gameplay 12 times, it really becomes kind of unwatchable sometimes. And usually I try to think about it as much as I can and try to move the camera as little as I can. But in this case, there's just so many little details and so much stuff that you can't just copy-paste around that I couldn't really help but have to move the camera all the time. In the next episode though, which I am currently in the process of recording, I am building a few buildings and really just focusing on their facades, so I'll be moving the camera around as little as possible, which so far has actually been going really great. It's something that I've always tried to keep in mind, but never really took to the max to try and plan my building ahead in such a way to move the camera as little as possible. But that's something which I might want to try a little bit more. Because the way that I've always looked at these videos is like, these time-lapse videos are just sort of more of a byproduct of doing this stuff, because I would have been building it anyway, but in this case I can make some videos out of it, which is great for everyone. But by now these videos often get more views than the actual final videos of these projects, so I might as well focus on these videos as their own thing, and not just a byproduct of some end product that I'm working toward. So maybe I'll think about those kind of building ways a little bit more in the future. But for these bridges, it was honestly kind of difficult, because they're kind of large, kind of all over the place, and really I have to pay attention to the most minute details to try and cover up all of these little steel parts and things that I want to make invisible as much as possible. So yeah, that was actually all for the catwalks and that whole area over there. But then I realized there was still this bridge, which was so far kind of floating. and one of the problems that I had with this bridge, honestly, is that it seemed unsupportable, because the way that it's built is really giving myself a hard time. It was kind of stupid to do this in the first place, because you'll notice that all of the other bridges, they have unbanked track, and the track doesn't move up or down. Maybe there's a slight angle in the bridge, or it's quite steep actually, but there's no difference in steepness in most of the other bridges. But this one is just kind of annoying because it goes from going up to going down, so there's a bit of an arch in it, and it also goes from banking to the left to banking to the right, so it's really a goddamn annoying bridge to support. And that's why I kind of didn't want to do it for the longest time. But at this point I really figured, you know, I need to stop procrastinating. I didn't want to end the episode at 14 minutes something, so I decided to build this thing as well and add something to this surrounding area. And in the end, what actually kind of helped was to just build the wooden planks according to the curvature of the track, I suppose. Try to just make sure that they all connect to all of the track pieces, and then just kind of go from there, which didn't even turn out to be that hard. I could just copy the curve from one side over to the other, and even if the whole thing looks a little bit strange, I think this is just about the only thing that I could do, and at least by combining all of these planks together, it is a strangely curved bridge that could theoretically actually be built in real life as well, so that's a problem out of the way. And I believe also that with this bridge built, all of the bridges in the park are finished, and there's not much to worry about anymore when it comes to that. Maybe I'm wrong with that? No, I think that's it. There's just a lot of foliage and a lot of rockwork to still do, so I'm also trying to chip away at the foliage and rockwork in every episode that I can as well. Now here's a little bit of fun detailing, which I already did with some of the lampposts and some of my earlier stuff, but I don't do all the time because it's something which takes way too many faces and way too many time for how much of a detail it really is. But I thought for this bridge you could actually kind of work out, and that's adding nails to all of the logs. So yeah, it's not something that you notice too much, but it definitely, you know, when you look at the whole thing as a whole, even if it doesn't stand out, it makes the bridge look a little bit more realistic. And I could insert the nails here, so I figured I might as well. Now the final bit here is me trying to do the foliage in such a way that I can cover up what's backstage, because honestly the end of the park, or at least the end of the public part of the park, and the border between the park and the backstage areas is just a few meters away from the path here. And I do want to cover that up, but at the same time I do want to make sure that these two drops are still open for the view as much as possible. So here's a little bit of a transition from low foliage to very tall foliage, and some other final details like the lamppost over there. All of the lampposts on the catwalk itself, I honestly haven't checked at nighttime yet, and I'm definitely gonna have to light up these bridges a little bit more than they currently are, but I am pretty confident that these bridges will look pretty swell at night. And I think these lamps do add a bit more of a Mine Train touch to the ride again, especially because they're these really small oil lamps, which I suppose you could either just place on crates or use as some kind of clutter or something like that, but I actually really like putting these things on small posts because they're one of the smaller, cuter lamp designs in the game, and it just looks quite simple, and that's more or less the look that I'm going for here. And the final part of this video should be making this little jump from one rock to the other. Most of this lift hill, unlike the other one, is supported by the terraforming, and it's really just covering the ground at all points. But there's this little space where it goes down a bit, which is partly because there's the curve right underneath there, and I didn't want to make too much of a steep cliff face, because I felt like that would look really unnatural. Like, there's no way that a natural mountain terrain would be perfectly 45 degrees and perfectly support this whole catwalk. So I wanted to make that a little bit more random. And at the same time, it gave me the opportunity to work on these small train rail supports looking things. I honestly have no idea what to call these things, but sometimes when you have a train rail that's built a few meters off the ground, you have these very typical wooden support beams underneath it, so that's really what these things are here for. I think it adds a bit more to the atmosphere. And that's basically it for this video. So, thank you guys for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed this video as much as I did, and I'll see you next time.